I hope everyone has been well here in Northern California. We have been having an atmospheric river that has dumped water on everyone for the last week or so, and more water continues to be in the forecast. So um, it has been dangerous even in some parts with flooding and a few deaths. But today is bright and sunny, at least where I am in San Francisco. So uh, I hope everyone else has been staying dry, staying warm, uh, and enjoying reading this very strange book, which I have uh, been rereading, of course, and discovering that it's an even stranger book than I had remembered. So um, it'll be interesting to hear what the rest of you think about it. Um, I'm going to wait another couple of minutes before starting, and I'll be turning things over to David Brownell, who is our discussion leader for today. And we have the assistance of Ava, who will be um, helping me and helping David, showing the slides that David has prepared, and also assisting the two of us with questions and responses from members of participants in the discussion. So if you have a question, if you want to make a comment, please use the raised hand function, or just wave your hand and Ava will help me and David to recognize people. So uh, anyway, I think we can go ahead and begin. I have a few announcements that I wanted to make uh, before turning things over to David. The schedule for today is to discuss chapters 13 to 28 of the Old Curiosity Shop. And as usual, uh, we are allowed to refer back to anything that occurred earlier in the novel, but we try not to refer ahead to anything that will happen subsequent to chapter 28. Uh, for the benefit of people who are reading the novel for the first time, and also to preserve something of the experience of reading serially, as Dickens's Victorian audience did. And the Old Curiosity Shop, you will remember, is serialized in the miscellaneous journal that Dickens edited called Master Humphrey's Clock. And when the sales of Master Humphrey's Clock were not up to his expectations, Dickens decided that he would use that form, the journal magazine form, to do a new novel. And so he took what had originally been an idea for a relatively short story and turned it into a longer narrative. And I think that the last minute decision to do that has something to do with the form of the novel, um, the structure, the episodic nature of this novel. Um, our schedule going forward, just as a reminder, is that we will not meet in December. There are too many competing events in people's lives in December, particularly toward the end of the month, for us to have a meeting. But we will resume in January and continue January, February, March, April. Yes, April will be the last meeting on the Old Curiosity Shop. And then in May and June, at the suggestion of our president, Wayne Batten, we will turn to another novel, Silas Marner by George Eliot, that has striking similarities with the Old Curiosity Shop. So there will be two meetings in May and June on Silas Marner. We do have a discussion leader for January, Ginny Hoffman. I hope that Ginny is here, but we do not have discussion leaders lined up for February and March. So I hope that there will be volunteers. If you are interested, if you are willing to be a discussion leader for the February and March meetings, please get in touch with Courtney or with me and let me know. You don't have to be an expert. You just have to be willing to facilitate the discussion and ask a few questions and engage the rest of the participants in a discussion. And just as a reminder of where we are in the novel, in chapter 12, the chapter that was our stopping point for last month's discussion, Nell and grandfather have run away from the curiosity shop where they live and have headed on the road for parts unknown. And so the departure from London is the first step in a journey that will continue for a long, long time in the novel. The episodes that we discuss today take us through several of the incidents, people and situations that Nell and grandfather encounter. These include notably the punch men who run the Punch and Judy show. It takes us to at least briefly, to the racetrack. It takes us to an inn called the Jolly Sandboys. It takes us to a school, and we meet the schoolmaster, and we hear some things about the schoolmaster and his students. And it takes us finally to meet Mrs. Jarley. And Mrs. Jarley is the proprietor of a waxwork show. And that's where chapter 28 leaves us. Along the way, there are some other things that are happening. If you will, these are side plots or plots that have been mentioned in the first section of the novel that involve Kit. Rather surprisingly to me, Kit turns out to have a larger role in the book than you might have suspected at the beginning. And we meet the Garland family, a cute family with a memorable pony that provides a lot of entertainment on the side. And we also bring back briefly Dick Swiveller and, of course, Quilp, and again, somewhat surprisingly, Fred Trent, Nell's brother. And there was a plot a marriage plot that was hatched in the early chapters of the novel. And so we should not forget in our focus on Nell and grandfather and their journey, we should not forget these other side plots or smaller pieces of the story that occur in the section that we're reading today. So with that brief introduction, I'll turn things over to David. David, please take it away. Thank you.
Okay. For me, one of the most interesting things about the Old Curiosity Shop is that Dickens is really winging it. He's didn't plan it to be a novel. He started publication and he's a jump ahead of the printer at all times. Any kind of serial publication where you haven't finished the book is tightrope walking without a net, but this one is particularly that way. And you can see places where he makes false start on something and then abandons it. So maybe the place to start is to ask you if you're enjoying the book and what things about it you want to talk about. You can do it, you can answer in chat, you can answer by using the raise hand function. Okay, Martha.
There. Hi, everybody. I'm thoroughly enjoying this reading, and I'm surprised myself because I didn't think I was going to enjoy it. But I've totally changed my mind, and I think it's a great read, and I think it goes, to me, it just seems like it goes from one section to another, and it's a smooth transition from one section to another, and it's just, and these characters kind of thrown at you. And I'm just, I just think it's well written by Dickens. And I think he's trying different things, and he has a lot, I believe he has a lot of his concerns in this book, education, domestic violence, treating people correctly, people like the dwarf that aren't very nice. So I think a lot of his concerns in the real world are showing up in this book. And, and particularly Nell and her situation and the domestic situation with her grandfather. And, it's just been very enjoyable to me. That's it.
I think one point you made is one I wanted to talk about a bit, but I want to get other people in. So I'll just ask a question and then we can get to it. How does Dickens organize the book? Okay, Kathy, you're up. Unmute yourself.
Is that me? No, wrong one.
Yes,
I got it.
Kathy Kraft.
Okay, so the book seemed fair to middling to me. I had never read it. I can see where he's writing at a huge pace, and it seems at times to be lighter than most of the books that I've read by Dickens. However, I really like, everything that the last person said I like about the book, all the themes that, that Dickens, really brought out in most of his books. But I teach aging and I also teach family dynamics in the family. And what I was interested in is that he's hitting on, it's a family drama in so many ways. The dysfunctional family is just, you can't make up what the crazy people do now and did then. And so the brother is about, it's all this crazy thing about Nell. They're going to marry her off and get her money. And, just what the relationship with the brother is, what the relationship with the grandfather is, because she's so, entangled in a good way with him. And, Dickens really was a genius in the politics of the family. And I actually studied at Oxford with us, and I got this book by Catherine Waters. It's called Dickens and the Politics of the Family. Now, in a telling way, Little Curiosity Shop is not here. I usually look at it because I'm interested in the family and the dynamics, but you can see that this is all family dynamics that's going on here in a bad way. And so I'm interested in it from that point of view.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point, well worth raising. Glenna, it's nice to see you.
Well, likewise. I was kind of going along for the first 12 or so chapters, hanging in, but then, and I wish I knew the chapter. I went back and I should have marked it. But when they first start on their journey, Nell goes to a graveyard and she encounters the grave of a very young man. And this old woman comes, and the old woman explains her relationship to the grave. I thought that was so beautiful. It's just about a paragraph. And I just thought, oh, there's so much truth to that paragraph about, how hard it is. Look at a very aged person and imagine them as a young, much loved bride of this young man who died, I think, at 23. And then the old woman's, over time, how she's dealt with her loss and so on. And it just made me appreciate how much, Dickens, of course, in like Pickwick Papers, he inserts all these tales. And I can take those or leave those, but some of them are better than others. But what I think is remarkable is and it's not even a question of organization. It's just that he has a genius for taking a moment and a character that you'll never meet again and giving you this incredible human insight into that particular person's situation. And when I had that encounter, I thought, oh, this is why I'm reading this book, for moments like this.
Yeah, I think you've raised a point, but I'm going to wait and let somebody else raise it also, because I think it's going to be noticeable. Karen.
Yes, I think that Martha hit on a really important point about the book, and that's the number of themes related to Dickens's social consciousness. And one of my favorite themes in the book that emerges, I think, starkly in this section is the kindness of strangers. And we meet certain people in this section who are so kind, and this whole kindness of strangers. We have the Garlands, we have the schoolmaster who is unnamed, that I think probably later on, maybe we want to talk about characters that are unnamed and what they might represent. And we have Mrs. Jarley. She's also kind, but this whole theme of kindness of strangers and the anonymity of it, I think, is something we need to watch for in the whole rest of the novel. The other thing I wanted to just say with some humor, I am an ardent animal lover, all species, and I happen to love all the little animal references in this book. I don't know if many of you know, but the Charles Dickens Museum in London right now, one of their exhibits is Faithful Companions, Charles Dickens and His Pets. And if you just Google the museum, if you're not on their website, the introduction that they have there about this exhibit is so captivating. But I love Whiskers. I think the bird in the cage with Kit is important. Freedom, lack of freedom, whatever. And it just reminded me of, Dickens. He had this canary who he named Dick, who hopped all over the breakfast table. He has all kinds of animals, and that just always warms me to the man. both as just a human being and as an author. And it's fun in this book. The cover of the Penguin edition is the dancing dogs, you know, from the circus, from the traveling circus. So just a fun aside.
Yeah, that scene in the inn with the dogs is one of my favorites. It just, I think in this book, a lot of what's there is the result of Dickens traveling around the country as a reporter and seeing things and remembering them. And all these strange things he probably ran into. I like your calling out the kindness of strangers. Barbara.
Thank you. I consider this book to be a mishmash of things, and that many of even the social issues he brings up are not very well explained or resolved. And the two things that I think perhaps we could talk about is first of all the kind of unexplained characters. The characters like the old man to start with. I mean, we have these characters that we are just supposed to accept, and even Quilp. I mean, what became the motivation for any of these characters, which is not clear at the beginning of the novel. And secondly is well, I guess melodrama also, the introduction of very melodramatic characters, and he seems to resort to those when he's stuck. That we get, we get the dying child, we get the cute horse, we get the schoolmaster, that whole thing, very sentimentality, I guess, more is what I'm trying to talk about. That how it is used and perhaps overused in this book. Okay,
That's a good one. We should talk at some point about sentimentality, which is a complicated subject. Wayne, good to see you.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. This is just a footnote to what Glenna brought up, the scene in the churchyard where we have the widow speaking with Nell. That's in chapter 17. It's about the 2.5 pages into chapter 17. Just a kind of footnote to what Glenna said. That's it.
Okay. Ava?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight Pat would like to speak. I'll just click unmute here.
Say that again.
Pat Thorne is going to speak. She just had trouble raising her hand.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't find that. I have a different version of Zoom now. I participate with UNLV for old people learning early, and so I think they switched to the university version, and so there's no chat capability. Anyway, that being said, this segment, these chapters that we read were so different than the first 12 chapters. The first 12 chapters were really dark and ominous, but however, I've come to consider that maybe this is a mystery novel, although I don't think Dickens wrote in his mystery novels. But if, these are my thoughts. Nell is the potential victim, and all of these odd characters that you cannot trust. You know, even though they seem trustworthy, I still have to be skeptical, but maybe that's my own paranoid ideation. They are lurking around waiting to inflict punishment on Nell. But however, the part about this segment of the novel, it has a different tone than the first 12 chapters because it is so Dickens' description of the scenery as they pass along, the grandfather and Nell pass, go along and stay in various places, is beautiful. It's just entrancing, I can envision the countryside. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Okay. I want to bring something up that I think has to do with various comments that have been made. Ava, if you would bring up the first slide.
Absolutely.
This is page 123.
Can you see my screen okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, one.
Nell is with her grandfather. There had been an old copy of the Pilgrim's Progress with strange plates upon a shelf at home, over which she had often pored whole evenings, wondering whether it was true in every word, and where those distant countries with the curious names might be. How many of you have ever read The Pilgrim's Progress? I'm not seeing all the people, but nobody seems to be waving their hands.
Oh, yeah, there's a couple there.
Who?
I think.
I've read it.
I've read it.
Great. If your grandparents or great-grandparents lived in this country and were Protestants, I'm sure they read the book. For a lot of American households, it was the second book acquired after the family Bible. When Huck Finn is describing the parlor at the Grangerfords, there's a copy there, and he tries to read it, and he says, the statements was interesting but tough. The March sisters in Little Women use it as an inspiration and model for their conduct. The reason I think it's worth talking about is it's because it's quite a different narrative form than we have run into with Dickens before. Go to the second slide, please, Ava. It's in two parts. The first one came out in 1678. John Bunyan was a tinker who spent a lot of time in jail because he insisted on preaching. And at that point, the government and the established church were trying to keep just anybody from preaching. They'd had too much enthusiastic religion during the Civil Wars. So this story is an allegory. And there are all sorts of references in it that you know. I thought I would give you just a taste of it. Christian, with his companion, Faithful, reached the town of Vanity, which is the location of Vanity Fair, where all sorts of merchandise are sold. Houses, lands, trades, places, that's jobs, honors, preferments, that's promotions, like becoming giving a clergyman a living, titles, countries, kingdoms, lusts, pleasures, and delights of all sorts, as whores, bawds, wives, husbands, children, masters, servants, lives, blood, bodies, souls, silver, gold, pearls, precious stones, and whatnot. And moreover, at this fair, there is at all times to be seen juggling cheats, games, plays, fools, apes, knaves, and rogues, and that of every kind. All these people are trying to sell their goods to Christian and Faithful. And Christian and Faithful injudiciously say that the only thing they want to buy is the truth. Well, this enrages everybody, so they're mobbed and arrested. Faithful is put on trial in front of Judge Lord Hategood. Next page, please. So there came in 3 witnesses.
David, Cynthia
Yeah.
had her hand raised.
But not to interrupt you.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, David, I'm really grateful to read this because it shows me the parallel between, one, Dickens' love of allegorical names, and 2, Dickens' love of lists.
Yes, good point. So there came in 3 witnesses, to wit, envy, superstition, and pickthank. You will note that I've cut it quite a bit. Then stood forth envy and said to this effect, "My lord, I've known this man a long time, and will attest upon my oath before this honorable bench that he is..." Judge, hold, give him his oath. So they swear him. Then he said, "My lord, this man, notwithstanding his plausible name, is one of the vilest men in our country. He neither regardeth prince nor people, law nor custom, but doth all that he can to possess all men with certain of his disloyal notions, which he in the general calls principles of faith and holiness. And in particular, I heard him once myself affirm that Christianity and the customs of our town of Vanity were diametrically opposite and could not be reconciled. By which saying, my lord, he doth at once not only condemn all our laudable doings, but us in the doing of them." Next page. Ava. Then the judge called to the jury, who all this while stood by to hear and observe, "Gentlemen of the jury, you see this man about whom so great an uproar hath been made in this town. You have also heard what these worthy gentlemen have witnessed against it." Then went the jury out, whose names were Mr. Blind Man, Mr. No Good, Mr. Malice, Mr. Love Lust, Mr. Live Loose, Mr. Heady, Mr. High Mind, Mr. Enmity, Mr. Liar, Mr. Cruelty, Mr. Hate Light, and Mr. Implacable, who every one gave in his private verdict against him amongst themselves, and afterwards unanimously concluded to bring him in guilty before the judge. And first among themselves, Mr. Blind Man, the foreman, said, "I see clearly that this man is a heretic." Then said Mr. Dugwood, "Away with such a fellow from the earth." "Aye," said Mr. Malice, "for I hate the very looks of him." So Faithful is condemned, he's scourged, he's beaten, he's lanced with knives, he's stoned and pricked with swords, and burned to ashes at the stake. But a chariot is waiting that carries him up through the clouds with the sound of trumpet, the nearest way to the celestial gate. Yeah. Bunyan is a very good for 1678, this is very clear prose, and the action moves, and it's very direct prose. The book is well worth the time to read if you never have. It's very much what people thought at the time, and there are all sorts of things in it that you will recognize as references. The reason that I wanted to dwell on it a bit is because it's different than a picaresque novel like Nicholas Nickleby, which is the book before this. The picaresque novel, the hero, the picaro, travels, but he usually has a goal, and he ends up finding his place in the world, usually ends up as a gentleman with property. Nell and her grandfather's journey is not at all of that sort. That's much more like Christian's journey. And in the second part of Pilgrim's Progress, Christian's wife, Christina, and her 4 sons travel the same path to get to the celestial city. The end is not prosperity, but death. So much for Pilgrim's Progress. Where was I going to go next? Let's see.
David, if I could, I would mention something, and Glenna has her hand up too. But just as a comment on what you have laid out for us by reading from Pilgrim's Progress, people may remember from the opening chapter of the Old Curiosity Shop, when Master Humphrey is still the narrator, that he describes Nell's presence in the Old Curiosity Shop, surrounded by all the strange objects that grandfather has collected and has ostensibly for sale, but they seem to be more like a museum or a collection than they are objects in a trade or a business. Grandfather doesn't seem to be very much interested in business. But Master Humphrey, as narrator, describes this strange situation, and there's even the opening illustration of the novel. Master Humphrey says, "It would be a curious speculation," said I, after some restless turns across the room, "to imagine her in her future life, finding her solitary way among a crowd of wild, grotesque companions, the only pure, fresh, youthful object in the throng. And he describes it as a kind of allegory. So from the outset, there are hints that Nell's position in the world and her surroundings have an allegorical dimension to them. And so to read this novel, which in many ways seems contemporary and contemporary to the Victorian world, there's also an otherworldliness that determines the structure of it as well. So that word allegory.
Yeah, Maxine, who's here, had an interesting idea about the Old Curiosity Shop itself. Would you like to tell us, Maxine? I don't know, maybe she stepped out, but I'll try and pick her up later. Glenna.
Yeah, when you were reading this, I haven't read Pilgrim's Progress since I was in my early 20s, but I realized how much some of the languages, some of the language and some of the conceits are part of my mental landscape. I always think to myself, I've got to stay out of the slough of despond, which comes right out of Pilgrim's Progress. And for me, in the 20th century, that I still have these things lurking in my mind, it just tells me that in an earlier era, this such a widely read piece of literature must have been, to an extraordinary extent, part of the mental landscape of so many literate people, or even illiterate people, because somebody might have read it to them. And I love the idea of relating it to the Old Curiosity Shop.
I've been mired in the slough of despond since the election. Barbara.
Some scholars, I believe, say that at one point during the Victorian era, there were probably more copies of Pilgrim's Progress in people's houses than Bibles. And that certainly the idea of the streets of heaven being paved with gold comes from Bunyan and not from the Bible. And it became as I was saying, it became part of the lexicon of normal people. But what was mentioned before, I think we also need to tie in the romantic ideas. I mean, we have all this long explanation that once they get out of the city where everything is jangled and horrible and get into the countryside, that immediately, it's a wonderful place. But here we have this dichotomy. We're going to this wonderful place and there are all these nasty people in it.
Yep. Okay, Maxine.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, you can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, what I said to David, I think the Old Curiosity Shop is England itself, because it has so many odd and curious characters. And the lady in the caravan specifically uses the word curious about Nell and her grandfather, such curious people. So that was my feeling. I don't know how other people feel about it.
That's worth having. Okay. Don't see any more hands.
I'll make one comment on that. I think it's interesting to remember that the title of this novel is a place and not a person. That the Old Curiosity Shop has reference that I think extends beyond the particular shop the location where the novel begins and to which we don't return very much.
Exactly.
So the Curiosity Shop has a broader range of reference. England itself, the world. So Pat's comment, I think, is very appropriate. The picaresque novel is usually named for the hero of the novel. Curiosity Shop does not have a hero in the conventional sense.
Yep. Going a little further in the book, is there anyone here who has ever seen a Punch and Judy show?
Yeah.
Go ahead and tell us about it.
Oh, well, when I was a kid, I lived in New York City. Okay. And it was not Punch and Judy, but they did have marionettes in the park. So I could relate to that. I did go to the Google machine and I looked up Punch and Judy to see the history of it. And it's helped me. It seems like it was initiated in Britain. But it's a similar situation where a group comes to town and then there is a play that's not necessarily always the same play. And some of the critique of it all was that there was the man who was the man in Punch and Judy was always beating up the woman with a stick or some other device. So after a while, it came out of favor. I think I don't know if they do anything like Punch and Judy anymore. It was a happening when I was a kid in New York.
Okay, Kathy?
Well, when I was young, there actually was sort of a Punch and Judy show on television, very early 50s television. And it was called Kukla, Fran and Ollie. And, at the time, I thought it was fabulous. I think I was 4 or 5 years old. I've also seen it. I'm trying to think of the name of the park in Paris. It escapes me right now, but there's a Punch and Judy show there, and I've seen it in New York as well. And I think it's a form of entertainment that is very old. But just as the last person said, there's a lot of I hated cartoons when I was young because it was always somebody beating someone else up, and I hated that. And Punch and Judy has a lot of beating up. Usually women, but men too. There's a lot of, that going, I can't remember who Fran or Ollie were, but one of them was beating one of the others up.
One of them was a dragon, wasn't it?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. Kath Beale?
Yeah, Punch and Judy's quite widespread in England. Usually on seaside, on coastal resorts. They have, when I first started to watch it in the 50s, it was very violent. Punch used to beat up Judy and he would be taken away by the policeman and he would be hung. And this was children's entertainment, apparently. Now it's far more sanitized. It's still quite funny. But it must be hundreds of years old, I think. It had been going a long time before Dickens wrote about it.
The first recorded performance in England was 1672.
Right.
1662. Mr. Pepys saw it and put something about it in his diary.
Thank you for that. I didn't know. I knew it had gone a long time. I wasn't sure how long. Thank you.
Okay. Ava, why don't you give us the first Punch and Judy slide?
On it.
And did you have something you want to say?
Oh, I'm raising my hand for Margaret, but after Barbara. I know she had her hand raised as well.
Okay. Clark?
I just saw Blitz, the new Steve McQueen movie about the bombing of London. And there's a moment in which there's a Punch and Judy show, and Punch is beating Hitler with his slapstick to the delight of the children in the audience. And
There's
there's not Punch and Judy. There's a great moment in 400 Blows where Truffaut turns the camera on children watching a puppet show. It's actually, I think, involved Little Red Riding Hood, violent, and the images of the children's faces is incredible. There's delight, there's terror, there's awe. These puppet shows touch something primal, which is why they've lasted. There's a great novel by Russell Hoban called Ridley Walker, in which he imagines a future time after a horrible nuclear apocalypse. And one of the ways that the government maintains the story is that they have a puppet show, and the figures are Punch and Judy, but they've been adapted for their own culture. So, you can go around the world and find that puppets do more than entertain. They tell a truth, maybe not very pretty all the time.
Barbara?
Yeah, I just want to point out that it seems to me that I saw Punch and Judy at fairs when I lived in England, but it seems to me that it grows out of Commedia dell'arte, and one of the things in Commedia dell'arte is that the women are kind of get the upper hand in these stories in one way or another. They don't Judy suffers, but in the end, usually she gets, and in the Commedia dell'arte shows, it's always the seemingly dumb, buxom woman, but in the end, she has the upper hand, which is an interesting thing, I think.
My research on this is only Wikipedia deep, but I've found a few things. Typically, there were two people like Codlin and Short. The professor or the punch man was in the booth operating the glove puppets. It had originally been marionettes, but considering the amount of violence, the strings were a real nuisance. The professor had a swizzle or swather in his mouth, which distorted his voice. He only used it for punch, and the rest of the time was trying very hard not to swallow it when he was giving voice to the other characters. The outside operator was the bottler, who introduced the show, collected money, and sometimes did crosstalk with Punch and the other characters. He also played music, often a drum and panpipes. He encouraged audience participation and gave the professor a signal to cut the show short if the crowd wasn't producing enough dough. The scenes are almost always with two characters. The dialogue is improvised, and the professor may choose how many characters to add. Mr. Punch has a hunchback and a long nose and a very bad temper. Typically, his wife Judy tells Punch to take care of the baby and goes off. The baby won't stop crying, so Punch hits it with his slapstick or throws it down. That one doesn't play so well these days. The slapstick comes out of Commedia dell'arte. It's two thin sticks bound together to look like one. And when you hit something with it, the one piece hits the other with a good deal of noise, and it sounds like you're hurting somebody much more than you are. When Judy gets back, she and Punch fight. He knocks her out of the stage and says, "That's the way to do it," which is his catchphrase every time he deals with another character. He's always self-satisfied, as pleased as Punch. He deals with other characters who may include Joey the Clown, a policeman, a doctor, and finally the hangman, the devil, or a crocodile. In each case, Punch uses the slapstick successfully as the audience applauds him. In older versions, he got carried off to be hung or the devil grabbed him, but again, saved by the slapstick. Sometimes there was a real live dog, Toby, who was a participant. It all moved very quickly. I have read but have not found that there's a transcript of a Punch and Judy show in Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, which is a great Victorian source book. He was sort of a Victorian Studs Terkel. He went around and talked to people about what they did and wrote about it. Ava, can you give me Dickens's letter?
Are you able to see it?
Hmm?
Are you able to? Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, I can read it aloud, but I figure that you all, almost everybody here probably knows how to read. So unless you want me to read it, I won't. I kind of disagree with Dickens here. I think Punch is a traditional trickster figure, and the audience likes him because he does outrageous things and gets away with them, which may explain some of Trump's popularity. In 1841, a new magazine appeared in London. Cost threepence a copy, like Master Humphrey's Clock, and it took the name Punch, possibly because it meant to hit everyone with a stick of wit. Ava, show us the cover of Punch. A lot of the people involved with it were friends of Dickens, like the editor Mark Lemon. When Punch was young, it had really sharp teeth and took on social evils and thwacked away at them. By the time I was seeing it in the 1950s, it was pretty well toothless and suburban. But the question I have to ask is, does Punch remind you of anybody in the novel?
Cynthia has her hand up.
Yeah, Cynthia.
Thank you, David. That was so illuminating, and it made me feel that Quilp was Punch. That the way that you've described Punch makes me think that perhaps the contemporary readers would have seen Quilp as a kind of Punch.
I think so, yeah. Which means that in part he's a comic villain. He's over the top. Kathy?
I would say that, referring to the novel, that the whole group that is at the fair and that they travel with, that Mrs. Jarley refers to as the punch people. Mrs. Jarley says that they are low people, which meaning, that they're like a class beneath her and everyone else. And to me, that, when you were talking about Pilgrim's Progress, knaves and generally bad people, anti-Christian, if, in that context, are all these people, are many of the people that Nell meets along the way. I mean, certainly, the Punch and Judy people who, are, she's afraid of, and she and the grandfather are running away from, and end up at I think at the school teacher's house. So they, that it all ties together. And I mean, at least to me, in the class system, certainly of England and here as well, in a little bit different way, and the book.
Good. I've got more to say about that in a little bit, but I'm going to wait and see. Is there anything in chat I need to answer?
David, I think also Margaret had a point earlier, or she was trying to raise her hand earlier. Margaret Tamulanis. No, okay, never mind.
There is one comment in the chat that I would like to read. It's from Dorothy Stewart. And she said that she's enjoying the characters, even Quilp. She giggled at Quilp when he said, "I don't eat babies, I don't like them." So I think there are ways in which Quilp is a comic villain, as you say, and his violence and his immorality. He's amoral. He hates everybody. And it comes back for me to a question that Barb Rainey, about what motivates Quilp? Why is Quilp the way he is in the novel? And Maxine has her hand up. So
yeah,
I can't see him comic at all. I think he is a sadist. What he enjoys is the pain and suffering of the people. It goes way beyond his getting some financial advantage out of it. I mean, when he has his wife sit there through the night, there's no reason for that. It's just he enjoys how uncomfortable she is. Or when he even attacks the dog. So I think his motive is pure sadism.
well, I think one has to remember that he's a dwarf and that he has presumably various resentments. He's truly awful, but I think there's a comic aspect because he's so over the top. He's so unreal. He's not very funny, but he's, to my mind, a lot of comic characters are awful people. Consider Falstaff, for example.
Barb.
Well, he's also awful in that it's hard to, we don't exactly know where he has derived his power. I mean, how did he pinches his wife, but he can't be pinching all these other people and bruising them up. I mean, there has to be some power that he is exerting that has got him into this position. And he also seems to appear kind of magically different places. There are several scenes where, poof, there he is. And, he's, I think he's way over the top and oftentimes amusing in the way that he acts.
This brings me back to a question I asked earlier, which is, how is the book organized? Meanwhile, Kathy has her hand up.
was just going to say, when little children watch Punch and Judy, they're essentially really like us in that why do we read mystery novels that are bloody and awful that, we like to go through horrible things, but only vicariously. And so a comic villain, and in as many ways that, I mean, Punch and Judy is exactly, an example of that in that, children laughing and, one of the gentlemen that I forget one, but he was great, was talking about, they were, a Punch was beating Hitler and then, so that I think a comic villain, which I think that, the dwarf is, but also, the whole group of the Punch group at the at the fair, they're all comic villains. And it's because, we as adults are very much like children. I mean, why does everybody watch murder mysteries on television? Which are especially brutal because you're vicariously experiencing what you don't want to really experience in person. And that's a it's a form of writing that that Dickens is using at that time.
Okay, anybody want to tackle my question about how the book is organized?
Before we do, I'll chip in one further thing about Punch and Judy. Punch and Judy is not a realistic form of art. It's a parody. It's an exaggeration. It's puppets. It's not real people. And I think, in a sense, this takes us back to the question of allegory, that Old Curiosity Shop is a very strange mixture of realistic description and exaggerated, emotional, sentimental, melodramatic, over the top, all these terms that I think are apt to describe it are mixed together. And Quilp is a supernatural character. And Barb talks about the way that he appears poof out of nowhere. In the last chapter that we read, chapter 28, Quilp has not, the basic plot of the Old Curiosity Shop is Quilp is pursuing Nell. But for many of the chapters, for almost the entire section that we read for today, Quilp and Nell are not together in the same place. But in chapter 28, poof, out of a dark place in a building, there is Quilp right next to Nell. And Nell is hidden, so Quilp doesn't see her. And we overhear Quilp going, waiting to catch the stage to take him back to the city, back to London, because London is Quilp's neighborhood. London is the place where Quilp hangs out and feels at home. But Quilp can be anywhere. So there's a kind of magical, supernatural, diabolical quality to Quilp that's also funny and puppet-like. And the danger that he poses to Nell is very real in one sense, and it's also supernatural, exaggerated, unrealistic. And that mixture is one of the, I think, characteristic features of the Old Curiosity Shop. Realism and allegory, puppet show, and sociological documentation, all mixed together.
Okay, Barbara.
In some places, to me, it's like almost like the Keystone Cops. And we've got even the wives, the slices, we go from one little scene to the next quickly, like almost a movie kind of thing. And it also seems like this kind of very slow chase plot, but with things mixed in, like romanticism, which I do want to get back to, because we have these clear clashes that I'm not certain quite work in this book, but they're there, where he is trying to say to us, the countryside is so wonderful, and yet it's not. It's not. It's a scary place. Those of us that grew up in the countryside know this too, but I mean, somehow we got this idea of romanticizing the rural.
It is. Okay, Karen.
Back to your question about how the book is organized, I started to try to figure that out in this section. And what I did was keep track of how many chapters were in London versus in the countryside. And in this particular section, going back and forth, only six of the 15 chapters are set in London, and the others are set in the countryside. And what Barbara says is so true, because if you document what happens in London, in that landscape, that urban landscape, this is where I think we see Dickens' social concerns. We have populous poverty, poor streets, scanty space. He describes it as squalid, damp. Children are scantily fed and clothed. There's fear and greed and foreboding. And if you document on the other side of that how he describes the countryside or open country, even though there are dangers there, over and over, he talks about freshness, the singing of the birds, wildflowers, a place to lay aside troubles. Larks are trilling, the grasses are weaving. So, that's the organization that I chose to look at in this section anyway, and just try to keep track of a little bit.
Yeah, he goes back and forth between the London characters and Nell and her grandfather. I find the pastoral elements not very convincing. I don't think that's Dickens at his best descriptively. Clark.
This may be completely irrelevant, probably is, but I just finished teaching The Winter's Tale and thinking about, a problem play, but it's urban and rural, and a great thief character who's also very entertaining. And I can't help but think of this novel as kind of Shakespearean. I mean, who's your favorite villain? Iago. Come on. You like the bad guy. There's something about him that's very appealing. And I think there is something a little bit kind of mythic and difficult, because Dickens is pulling together, as Shakespeare did in The Winter's Tale, very disparate elements, cramming them into a space and asking you to accommodate that and to think about how these forces are at work. I'm out.
Yeah, I like your point. One of the things about some of the Shakespeare villains, Richard III being a good example, is how much they enjoy their own villainy. They're very self-conscious of see how clever I am. Peter, it's good to see you.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I missed, I couldn't find the button for raising my hand. So I missed talking about Quilp. There on chapter 19, I think they're talking about dwarves and giants and their role, in the, in entertainment. If you have too many giants and they're really rare, if they're not rare, then people are going to like ignore them or something. and he starts talking about, they start talking about dwarves. And this struck me as kind of like a meta moment where Dickens is making fun of himself, he says, the older a dwarf is, the better worth he is, returned Mr. Buffin. A gray-headed dwarf, well wrinkled, is beyond all suspicion. Meaning, it's like you got to have a good dwarf to be entertaining. It's in the circus. So it's kind of like Dickens is like commenting on, well, of course, I have to have a dwarf in my, the reason I put him in there is because, I'm making this Punch and Judy show and I have to give you the, the ogre. So otherwise it wouldn't be entertaining. So anyway, so chapter 19, where they're talking about dwarves and giants, struck me as a kind of a metafictional moment where Dickens is kind of like talking about his own process of creating this entertainment for you. So anyway,
I like it.
So it's like a gray-headed dwarf, well wrinkled, is beyond all suspicion. I mean, you need a good gray-headed dwarf in your in your comedy. Okay, forget it. I'm done.
There's a book that I read when I was young called, I think, Step Right Up. It's by a guy who went to work in a carnival sideshow, and he learned to be a sword swallower and a fire eater. But he said that people with acquired skills like that were second class to the real freaks. That it was all very well, but somebody who was born weird was much more, had more status in that world. Ava?
Caitlin is trying to raise their hand or would like to make a point.
And Pat also raised her hand, so we should get to Pat.
Okay, good.
I guess I'll go. This is Pat. So, I was thinking about Charles Dickens writing this book. And he's under duress. He's writing it every week. He has to have a portion written. And it seems to me that it's so different than it's different than his usual style. I'm trying to think of Pickwick Papers. So this is like the second, right, of his books. Pickwick Papers was a little hodgepodgey to me too, but it's been a long time since I read it. But his other novels all seem to have a point. They start with the young man who is seeking to be a better person, yada, yada. Or it's, what's the one about France and England? The others seems to have a plot. This one seems to like he's making it up as he goes along because he's got to meet a deadline. My apologies to Charles Dickens if that's not true, but I can't, I won't know until we go further if how he constructed this novel. That's all I'll say.
Well, like I say, he's winging it. He's making it up as he goes along. And it's interesting to see what floats to the surface of his brain when he hasn't had a chance to plan it. After this, the following books, he begins to get more into planning. The next one is Barnaby Rudge, and he'd had that in mind for 5 years and thought maybe it was his first real novel because it was a historical novel like Walter Scott. And after that is Martin Chuzzlewit, which he thought was about greed. Then Dombey, which he thought was about pride, although it expands a good deal in the process. And after that, he's planning them more and more. Ginny.
I think it's interesting. This novel is a lot like Pickwick because they're on a journey going different places and all the people they encounter as they go along the way. So what you have is Nell and her grandfather on this journey like Pickwick was to interact with all these different people. But it also reminds me of the old Western where suddenly it's now back at the ranch. And that's when they go back to London, you know, what's happening there to see what's happening with Quilp or Kit or the other people. We don't want to forget about them. We're on this journey, but let's go see what's happening there. And I think he goes back and forth to juxtapose this story of a journey with London that he's left and the characters he left behind. And of course, Quilp popping up everywhere, but Kit is still back there and he's got things going on like the Garlands, and you don't want to lose track of anybody because like Dickens, you know, everything's going to get woven together at the end, even if it's going to take him a while to get there.
Good. Gary.
Oh, sorry. Before Gary, Caitlin was up to speak as well.
Oh, Caitlin, I'm sorry.
I think Caitlin, are you able to speak or unmute?
I'm not seeing Caitlin on my screen, so
Yeah.
that's why I've been ignoring her.
No, absolutely. I think she's having some trouble unmuting. It's okay. We can go to Gary first and come back. Thank you, David.
Well, I like the earlier comment about this novel being Shakespearean, and in some ways, I was thinking earlier about about the setting, and of course, and oddly, in the this might be the antithesis of what would happen in Shakespeare, but in his comedies, the rural or the pastoral is a place of disorder, and the kingdom is the place of order, say in Midsummer Night's Dream or As You Like It. And in a way, what Dickens is doing here is maybe the opposite of that. I'm not quite sure. But I just like that idea of this journey into the rural, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen as it goes on. But where is the order, in other words? And we're not quite sure. We're not sure at this point.
I'll throw in a question here. What scene keeps popping up with Nell and her grandfather?
Good question.
Where do they meet the Punch and Judy show?
Can you repeat the question?
What is the setting that keeps
the setting? Yeah.
appearing with Nell and her grandfather as they travel? Where do they meet the Punch and Judy men, for example?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, but it's very interesting when they're first introduced to the Punch team, to the, what is the name of the first guy? Timothy something, and the second is Short, and they talk among themselves, and you learn that the first guy is not a good guy right from the beginning, but he says, I looked at enough people, being on the stage, I looked at enough people and I do understand people. But it turned out that Nell understood him very well. He couldn't trick Nell. And we talked about the chapters seeming to be out of sequence, but one thing that I think is in sequence is the way Nell develops. Because when she's still in London, she does all the physical work, but it's exactly what her grandfather is in control and tells him what to do. And here, Nell is developing. The roles change. She is the adult person. And the lady who earlier on talked about kindness, the very first scene where she's looking for some milk, and she needs, and she observes, like, like talking about observing people and learning to understand people. She's observing the people, trying to decide whom to ask for a favor. And she finally picks this family that has dinner around the table because there is a grandfather there as well. And her choice is wonderful. And along the way, her understanding of people and the choices that she makes are just perfect. So I think there is a thread, the one thread that makes sense and goes continue is the development of Nell herself.
I've seen a couple of people whose comments have popped up on the screen mentioning the graveyard. Anybody want to expand on that?
I would like to expand on the graveyard, if it's okay. I think that this is one scene that seems unconnected, but I feel it is connected because almost one of the beginning chapters that we read, I don't know if it was 13, 14, Nell is reflecting about separating from Kit and the fact that she is not crying, she's not shedding tears. And she goes through some philosophizing about separations. And she said, separating from a person who is still alive is probably different than separating from a person who passed away. And I think this thing on the graveyard, so we had examples of separating from Kit, separating from people that are alive, and the grave scene gave it an example of separating. She learns about separating from a person who is dead, so.
Okay, let's get Caitlin in.
Let's see, can you hear me, David?
Yeah.
I sure can.
Okay. Forgive me, I keep clicking on the wrong buttons, trying to participate. I appreciated your comments about the circus sideshow, because when I even see the title of this book, The Old Curiosity Shop, I think of some of the earliest examples of collections usually done by kings and emperors are called the Cabinet of Curiosities. And all the things that, I mean, yes, there might be something that's simply valuable, the world's largest diamond, I guess. But most often it's oddities. And there could be even things that are rather upsetting to see, unborn fetuses or abnormal human beings, with 3 legs or preserved in fluid and it is very much, and could well be like going to a freak show, at a carnival, the bearded lady, et cetera, people who physiologically are not, quote, considered normal. When we are first introduced to Quilp, I mean, I'm very struck by the occurrence of disability, or at least physical non-normalcy. I don't know what the correct phrase is for this, but somebody with a humpback, somebody with the Mr. Garland and his son, don't they both have a club foot?
Yes.
Yes.
And we've got a dwarf. And unfortunately, and I had a friend who once worked on this subject who had a disability herself for her dissertation at Berkeley in the English department. But the occurrence of disabilities, physical deformities, if I may use that phrase, in literature frequently are connected quickly to bad character.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, you're supposed to sort of, it's the disability indicates some sort of punishment that the Lord has affected upon this person by reason of their moral character.
Yeah.
Now, that isn't so far the truth about Mr. Garland and his son, right? But certainly we are allowed to know that pretty quickly about Mr. Quilp. And I remember a certain moment when I think it's Dickens, the narrator, maybe it's Mr. Humphreys, who's actually speculating why Quilp is such a bad guy. It only goes on for a few lines. It's towards the beginning of the novel. but he actually alludes to this person being angry and resentful that he is abnormal and he's treated as the other, you know, because of his dwarfness. And he's going to get back at the world for this. So anyway, when I think you asked what is the structure of this novel, of course I agreed so much with you, Pat, when you said, you know, I'm terrified for little Nell. I think it's fear that drives the drama and fear that drives the reader, wanting to protect little Nell. She's not big Nell. She's not almost grown up Nell. She's little Nell, and she's so vulnerable. And even Kip, you know, stands across the street in the shadows all night trying to make sure she's safe because she's left alone. She's 14 years old. She's left alone in a house. Everybody knows her grandfather's somewhere else. And now we're going off into the countryside. There's even sort of less protection for her safety, for her sexual integrity, you know, her young womanhood, etc. So it's we have fear sort of pushing these two pretty frail people, you know, out into nowhere. And as another, I might have been also Pat, who mentioned the kindness of strangers. What we find is the deepest form of hospitality, which is basically food, drink, and shelter. That's almost unquestioningly given by, you know, the few good people they meet. So those are some accumulative thoughts.
Okay.
We're sort of at the sideshow. The structural answer, I think, is we're just at the sideshow. We're just, you know, going from tent to tent or booth to booth to see the next odd person.
Okay. I'm going to pause you, Barbara, because the next in line is Blair, and we haven't heard from him so far. So tell us what you want to say, Blair.
Thank you for picking up on your question about graveyards. Yeah, let me get a little closer to the microphone. Can you hear me now? I can be heard. Very good. My face will be a little too big. I apologize. I want to follow up on your question about graveyards. I mean, Dickens, you almost have to look for a novel in which he did not include a graveyard scene. I mean, think of it. There's a graveyard scene towards the end of Bleak House. Christmas Carol famously has one. Think of the Pickwick Papers with their story of the goblins that stole a sexton. Think of the beginning of Great Expectations. Where does Pip meet? And even towards the end of Nicholas Nickleby, there's a touching scene at a grave. And we tend to think of graveyards as being something that is separate from the way we live. But if we go back to Dickens' time, Christian tradition had people being buried at first under the churches. And then when they ran out of room under the churches, they were buried in the hallowed ground that surrounded the churches. It wasn't until the late Victorian era that we Western Europeans and Americans started suburbanizing our graveyards away from the center of town. The readers, original readers of Dickens' works would be quite familiar with the idea that there would be graveyards that they would pass on their way to the pub, or because they'd be in the center of town. Anyway, just my thoughts about graveyards and how common they were. We tend to not think of them as common in our 21st century lives, but it was common for the people back then. I think I've said too much. I'm done.
Okay. I'm going to appeal to John here. There's a quotation that I can't get quite right, and you'll know it. It's Dickens is talking about what he wants to do in writing is a mixture. He talks out bacon with fat and lean. He never wrote anything that is sort of straight tragedy. He tries to scare you, or he tries various things, but then he goes back to comedy, and he always has this comic sensibility. What was it that he said, John?
It's from Oliver Twist, and the narrator talks about the alternation between um, comic scenes of farce and melodramatic scenes of death or the threat of death. And he says it is like streaky bacon, the alternation between the white and the red in streaky bacon. So it's an allusion to the structure of melodrama, particularly the alternation of different moods and different tones in the same work.
Thank you. I knew that you would know. Okay, Barbara.
Blair said most of what I was going to say, and I totally agree. And the idea that graveyards being connected to the church, and that would be a familiar kind of setup. And, you know, now we've moved them as far away, way out into the countryside, away from the, you know, but that's a whole nother topic. But I just wanted to point out one of the things he tries to do at the beginning of chapter 16 that really struck me. This is when they come into the graveyard at the first time, and he's talking about the ivy that grows and creeps over the mounds, and then he talks about how these were poor humble men twining for them the first wreaths they had ever won. And it struck me how close to Gray's elegy in a country churchyard that is, the idea that these, you know, they could have won these wreaths, but because they were poor and, you know, not entitled, they are here, you know, with just this ivy running over their graves. I'm not certain, once again, that he did a terribly good job of weaving that into the novel, but it's a nice idea.
Once said about Hamlet that it's a play made up entirely of quotations. Gray's elegy, it's that also.
Yes.
And you could go home and reread Gray's elegy. Okay, I have, a hand. Margaret.
Yes, thanks. I'd just like to go back to Sarah's comment about the structure of the novel and the development of little Nell as the linchpin of that. And I thought that Sarah's observation was very deep and worth our discussion. And also I'd like to twin with that the relationship between Nell and her grandfather, which does evolve throughout the novel from the very beginning. And I'd like people's thoughts on that, like who really decided that they would hit the road. It seems that the grandfather recovered sufficiently to be very, very strong in his insistence that they go on the road. And I'd just like more discussion about that, because I did read the essay about the two narrators in this novel. And that was one of the suggested readings that for this group meeting. And I really didn't understand the essay about the two narrators, because I sensed the two narrators like in the walk as Nell and her grandfather go outside of London, that there is in the old-fashioned word, the omniscient observer who is seeing all of London behind them and all of the countryside before them. But Nell and her grandfather have the sore feet, and they just want to put one foot in front of the other. So we have the omniscient narrator and the scenes where Nell and her grandfather experience meetings and everything like that. So I hope I'm not being too vague on what I want the discussion to come through, maybe not in this session, but long after next year, in next year, about the structure of the novel and how it hinges upon the characterizations of Nell and the grandfather. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to let that question stew for Maxine. You're muted. You're muted.
Maxine, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
There, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
What I said was that the whether they're in the country or in the city, there's one thing that goes through their relationship, and that's the exploitation of the child by the parental figure. And I think that probably goes back to Dickens' own experience when he was young. He was sent to the blacking factory. I mean, there's some leftover sense that this is what can happen to children, and then obviously resentment of it.
I like that, yeah. Okay. And now, as Monty Python says, for something completely different, I want to get something in here. Ava, can you give me the first slide on Frith?
Yes, here you are. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
The connection here is the racetrack. Frith did these huge paintings with characters in crowded places. They were enormously popular. Frith said at one point in his memoirs that he was proud because at the Royal Academy, they'd had to put a railing and a policeman in front of his painting there because the crowd around it was so strong, so huge. Okay, let's see what the next is. These are some of his panorama paintings. The top one is Life at the Seaside, which is in the Royal Collection. The railway station, the private view at the Royal Academy, which in the right-hand corner, if you could see it large enough, Oscar Wilde is talking and giving a lecture. And you see he did these immensely detailed things. But the one I want is now the next one. No, well, that will do for a start. That's Frith's portrait of Dickens. They were friends. And the other one with the portrait of Dickens, Dickens commissioned a portrait of Dolly Varden in the next book he wrote, which is Barnaby Rudge. And that remained in Dickens's collection until the auction after his death, when it sold for 1,000 guineas, which was a lot of dough. Okay, now go on to the Derby Day. This is the racetrack toward which Nell and her grandfather are going. Racetracks were sort of dangerous because all classes could show up and mingle. You can't see clearly, but on the left side, there's a thimble rigger working with the aid of a Confederate. The thimble rigger was getting you to bet money on which thimble the P was under while he was palming them with his hands. I think the guy in the laborer's smock is probably his Confederate. In the middle, you have an acrobat and his child. The child is busy looking at somebody who's setting out a picnic from a box labeled Fortnum and Mason. Frith got an acrobat and a child, but they were unsatisfactory models because they wouldn't stay still. So he rented their clothes and put them on real models who knew how to pose. But go on to the next one. We're going to look a little more detail at the right side. Do you remember? Let's see if I can find this scene. Page 157, chapter 19 is a description of the racetrack. Men who'd lounged about all night in smock frocks and leather leggings came out in silken vests and hats and plumes as jugglers or mountebanks, or in gorgeous liveries as soft-spoken servants at gambling booths, or in sturdy yeoman dress as decoys at unlawful games. Black-eyed gypsy girls, hooded in showy handkerchiefs, sallied forth to tell fortunes, and pale, slender women with consumptive faces lingered upon the footsteps of ventriloquists and conjurers, and counted the sixpences with anxious eyes long before they were gained. As many of the children as could be kept within bounds were stowed away with all the other signs of dirt and poverty among the donkeys, carts, and horses, and as many as could not be thus disposed of ran in and out in all intricate spots, crept between people's legs and carriage wheels, and came forth unharmed from under horses' hoofs. The dancing dogs, the stilts, the little lady and the tall man, and all the other attractions, with organs out of number and bands innumerable, emerged from the holes and corners in which they'd passed the night and flourished boldly in the sun. Nell and her grandfather followed. The child bore upon her arm a little basket with her flowers, and sometimes stopped with timid and modest looks. See the girl with the basket at the very right, to offer them at some gay carriage, but alas, there were many bolder beggars there, gypsies who promised husbands, and other adepts in their trade. And although some ladies smiled gently as they shook their heads, and others cried to the gentleman beside them, "See what a pretty face," they let the pretty face pass on and never thought it looked tired or hungry. There was but one lady who seemed to understand the child, and she was one who sat alone in a handsome carriage, while two young men in dashing clothes, who had just dismounted from it, talked and laughed loudly at a little distance, appearing to forget her quite. There were many ladies all around, but they turned their backs or looked another way, or at the two young men, not unfavorably at them, and left her to herself. She motioned away a gypsy woman urgent to tell her fortune, saying it was told already and had been for some years, but called the child towards her, and taking her flowers, put money into her trembling hand and bade her go home and keep at home for God's sake. This painting was done some years after the book came out, but it's interesting partly how Dickens is avoiding saying, hey, she was somebody's mistress, and that's why she's being shunned. But there she is with her keeper, who doesn't look like a terribly nice fellow, and the barefoot flower girl, and the gypsy in the background. I couldn't resist.
We're missing pictures.
There are other Victorian books in which the racetrack is a dangerous place, such as Charlotte Young's The Three Brides. The child's nursemaid takes the child off to the races, and to keep the baby quiet, doses it with Godfrey's cordial, which was an opiate. Mrs. Beeton, in her cookbook, warns housewives to watch out and not let the nursery maid use Godfrey's cordial. Okay, that's enough of the slides. Now let's see who wants to talk.
Pat has her hand raised.
Okay.
You haven't talked about the teacher, or the, let's see, the the woman with the wax figures.
Mrs. Jarley, yeah.
Yeah, and nor the teacher. I don't remember if he has a name in this novel, but they're both interesting characters.
Yes, well, now.
And Murray Baumgarten has his hand up too when we get to him.
Oh, good. Nell is surrounded by deaths, and we see the teacher whose favorite pupil, the promising child, dies. Mrs. Jarley, anybody want to say anything about her?
Well, she could have been an evil person. She's certainly using Nell to her advantage. I mean, she's using her for her beauty, obviously, to collect the money and etc. It's fairly typical of that sideshow kind of thing. I can't remember if she was developed much. The carriage was interesting that she rode around in, that they all rode around in. She has two sides to her too. Maybe she's kind of like Quilp a little, although she's not as obviously evil. She has a good side. She fed the grandfather and little Nell, and yet she's setting out to use her. I was waiting for her to strike out at Nell, but she'll just use her for whatever her needs are, apparently, unless somebody else has a different thought about her.
Well, she uses her in a kindly way at any rate. Okay, Murray.
She offers, I'll just add this comment about Mrs. Jarley. She offers Nell a job, and the Garlands do the same thing for Kit. So there's a similarity there. I mean, to offer employment, and in exchange for the labor, to get food and shelter, and in the case of Nell and grandfather, transportation, because Nell and grandfather, remember, are walking and their feet hurt. Their feet are blistered. And so anytime that anybody gives Nell and grandfather a ride, it's a genuine gift.
And she also suggests some work for the grandfather. So she's the first one who sees the grandfather as a human being, not some, not just somebody that is useless.
Yes.
Okay,
That's a-
Rory, it's good to see you.
I want to point out a different way of reading this novel. By the way, this is one of Dickens's most popular novels in Europe. If you look at who quotes Dickens and which novel in the middle of the 19th century, The Old Curiosity Shop is among the most important of the books that people associated with Dickens. And I propose that's because, unlike the earlier novels that he wrote, which are, if you will, character driven or personal, individuals centered, this is a book about crowds. And I think the pictures that David has put forward are very important. This is a book that's trying to tell us about a whole society. And in that sense, we might say this is the first modern novel because it takes all of the society as its subject, not just individuals within it. And all the characters in it represent different groups of people in a whole society. So we need to think about this as a novel of multitudes and a novel that can't be only about character analysis of one, although the idea that little Nell is the person who goes through it and sees all these different experiences of these different masses of people and these social orders is a good one. But I think that what we have in this first modern novel, which I'm just using to help us see it as different from the ones that come before, is that Dickens has touched on and gotten at the notion that we live in a social soup, and that here is an example of a novel which tries to deal with the soup, all of those kinds of things. And the soup involves all these different kinds of people. And we can't only focus on individuals, but we have to focus on the way society constructs their relationships. So it's more like a novel written in the 20th or the 21st century than a novel that we expect to read from the 19th or the 18th century. And in that sense, we have to deal with multitudes and with groups. And that's how it was thought of at its time in Europe. Good. You finished? Yeah.
I'm going to have to think about that. That's a good point. Okay.
I think, David, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for leading us through this discussion, and the slides were very helpful and wonderful. I particularly enjoyed the Frith and the Punch and Judy explanation, as well as the trip through Pilgrim's Progress and John Bunyan, which I think is also a useful model for Old Curiosity Shop. So thank you, Ava, for your support, and thank you everyone for your attendance and participation. I think this was a very good discussion. I learned things myself, and I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving and happy holidays to come, and we will meet again in January.
Thank you, David and John.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, David. Happy Thanksgiving.
And
It
to
was
you,
great.
It was.
Thank you so much.